today I'm going to talk about terrorism, and this is a term we hear every day, unfortunately, in the news. Politicians use this term, and we think we know when a terrorist act occurs, and but at the same time, we don't have a good definition of terrorism, and there's no consensus on what terrorism exactly is, both among scholars and also among political and international organizations. So, what I'm going to do today is to criticize some official definitions of terrorism and also some two definitions of terrorism made by some scholars, and try to give another definition of terrorism. In order to do that, I have three assumptions that I think we have to keep in mind if you want to have a good account of terrorism and a good definition of terrorism. So I think that a good definition of act of terrorism must not be too inclusive. So there are different types of violence in the world, and the violence perpetrated by the state, the violence perpetrated by criminal organizations or by private citizens. And although I think that terrorism is just a small part of this universal violence, the violence that happens in the world, it is not a good thing to judge as terrorists. Also, all these actions that seems to be terrorist but are perpetrated by the state or by criminal organizations. And another requirement of my definition is that terrorism, these definitions must not be too far from common sense. So I believe that we use the term act of terrorism usually in a right way. And so I think that it is useful and explanatory to have a definition of terrorism that applies to cases in which usually we use this term. And another assumption is that I don't want that this definition be morally charged. I found that at the beginning I thought we should have a definition of terrorism which is morally charged, and so that when we find this definition, we condemn what a terrorism is. But I think that it doesn't work like that, because it is not an objective way on which we should see terrorism. So I'm going to talk about four definitions. Two of them are official, and two of them are made by scholars of terrorism. And the first one is the definition of domestic terrorism we find in the U.S. Code. And so it says that domestic terrorism is activity that involves dangerous activities to human life, and that violate federal law or state law, and also they intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or they influence the policy of a government, or they affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. And the last requirement is that it has to occur primarily within the U.S. territory. There is the same definition for international terrorism, it just changes the last requirement. So I think that there's a problem with this definition, because if you take some criminal organizations, they just act in this way. And so some of their actions are, of course, within the jurisdiction of the United States. They involve acts dangerous to human life, violating federal law. And think of a drug cartel that try to exert its influence over a territory, over the population. It certainly wants to intimidate and by its action or coerce as civilian populations. So this definition applies to criminal organizations as well, like mafia or drug cartel. And I don't want to say that these criminal organizations are terrorist organizations. I think there's a difference, and the main difference is that the main purpose of criminal organization is profit, whereas the purpose of terrorist organizations is not profit. It's something political, religious, or ideological. And another problem is that also the excessive force would constitute terrorism. So, for instance, take the repression of a demonstration by the police, and take, for example, that at a certain point the police open fire to the demonstration, even if they're not allowed to do that. Also, in this case, you meet all the three requirements. In particular, the action of the police seems to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, the people who are protesting. So I don't want to include as acts of terrorism the violent acts perpetrated by the police, and because I think they have a different nature. And so this is Seattle 1999, and in this case, a federal jury found that the city of Seattle violated the Fourth Amendment of the protest, arresting some of the people. So in this case, police committed a federal crime, tried to intimidate the civilians, and it happened within the U.S. jurisdiction. So I don't think that the U.S. Code definition is a good definition of terrorism. Then we have the United Nations definition, and it is in a secretary report by made in 2005 by Kofi Annan, and it says that terrorism is any action that constitutes terrorism if it is intended to cause death or serious bodily harm to civilians with the purpose of intimidating a population or compelling a government. So in this case, the target of terrorism is restricted to just civilians. Also in this case, I think that this definition is problematic because also in this case, it can include activity of criminal organizations and abuse of power, and so an excessive use of force, but also it excludes non-civilians as possible targets of terrorist acts. So take 9/11, in that case, the attack to the World Trade Center it would be an act of terrorism, whereas the attack to the Pentagon would not be an act of terrorism because they were not civilians. And it seems something clashing with our common sense and our common understanding of terrorism to judge differently these two acts. Then we have a definition of terrorism made by a philosopher, Georg, and I'm going to talk about his strong definition of terrorism. He says that terrorist acts, are acts by means of which effects are attempted to be brought about by means of terror, produced by means of violence against legitimate targets. So I think that Meggle is right in pointing out that we have to, in order to understand terrorism, we have to understand the motives behind the terrorism, and also we have to focus on terrorism as a set of action, as violent acts. But also in this case, I think there is a problem, because sometimes what he called the effects desired by the terrorists are not produced by the terror which is produced by the violence, but they are produced by the violence itself. So, for instance, in some cases, some of the terrorist acts are meant to be punishment. So, take for instance the Charlie Hebdo attack. It certainly wanted to produce an effect through terror, but it was also a sort of punishment of the cartoonists who depicted Muhammad in a ridiculous way. And so, not always the effects of terrorist acts are just produced by terror, but also by the action itself. And also in this case, it applies again the problem of unlawful use of force by police or the state when this violence is unlawful. And so the same problem applies again. Then we have the last definition I want to talk about, and made by Colin Wight, a professor of government and international relations at University of Sydney, who has an interesting approach of terrorism. He says that we have to focus on terrorism in the context of the state, how it relates to the state. And so he says that terrorism is a violence perpetrated by non-state actors against non-state actors, and that wants to communicate a political message in order to achieve a certain end. So also in this case, there is a problem that we exclude non-civilians as possible target of terrorism. And this is something that Colin Wight acknowledges, but that I actually find problematic. Because again, there's a problem of 9/11 where we have seems like two different kinds of actions. One against the World Trade Center that constitutes, that is terrorism. The one against the Pentagon, who says is something like political assassination. But again, this is something that seems striking with our intuitions about terrorism. For instance, he says that the attack to Margaret Thatcher made by IRA in 1984 is not an act of terrorism, is an attempt to do a political assassination, so something different from terrorism. So I came up with this definition, and for me, a terrorist act is a violent act committed by non-state actors in order to create terror and pursue an ideological, political, or religious end. So I think that it is important to talk about terrorism within the context of the state, but I think that the possible target can be also some state officials. Sorry about that. And I'm going to talk about some parts of my definition. And violent act, I intend that just as an intentional use of force to hurt, kill, or damage something or someone. So in this case, I take also cyber terrorism as a possible example of terrorism because it is against something rather than somebody. And state actors, I take the definition of state actors that Colin Wight has. So where state actors are people who are engaged in the direct maintenance of the state. So high officials, politicians, police officers, the military. And I take non-state actor all the other people. However, what is important is that the terrorist acts as a non-state actor when she or he is performing the terrorist action. So the terrorist can be a military, but when the terrorist act is performed, he's doing that as a civilian, not as a state actor. So, and an important part of the definition, of course, is terror, and the terror is meant to provoke a sense of vulnerability, and so the aim of terror is that if it happened to this particular person, it can happen also to you, and sometimes terror is meant to be directed towards the whole population without distinction. Sometimes terror is meant to be directed toward just a certain category of people. like for what concerns left-wing terrorism during the 70s, they usually, like in France, Action Directe, Red Brigades in Italy, RAF in Germany, they usually targeted some particular categories of people, like military, businessmen, high officials. And of course, the terrorist act is meant to be, wants to be, has been made for ideological, political, and religious end. And this is, like I said, something that distinguishes terrorism from just criminal organizations. And because in the case of criminal organization, although in some cases they want to achieve a political end, this end is usually an intermediate end in order to achieve the most important end for them, which is profit, not a political religious end. And so many people talk about the message behind terrorist acts. I don't want to talk about, I don't want to include that in my definition of terrorism, because although in many cases there is a message behind the terrorist act, not in all cases there is a message behind those acts, or it is not that clear. For instance, on the 2nd of August in 1980, a bomb hidden in a suitcase at the station of Bologna blew up and killed 85 people. And so this action, nobody claimed responsibility for this action, although it is one of the deadliest attacks in Europe since World War II. And later they arrested some members of a neo-fascist organization who were responsible for this action, but they never claimed responsibility for this action. And so there have been many speculations about the reason behind this massacre, but and probably the most likely reason behind that is that this neo-fascist organization want to raise the social and political tension in Italy at that time. There wasn't a clear message behind this action. And I'll leave you with some possible questions we can talk about. And a problem is that in some cases, we don't want to talk about terrorism in case of guerrilla warfare or civil war or insurgency. And what I think about that is that in these cases, the size of the organizations is what matters the most. And so terrorist organizations usually do not have a large consensus within a certain state. And in these cases, the scenario changes. And so, for instance, in the case of civil war, we have two large factions fighting each other. And the same it happens with guerrilla warfare and insurgency. So I said that I wanted to be morally neutral. And so if we take my definition, there's no distinction between freedom fighters and terrorists. The definition of terrorism relies on a particular state. So when I talk about the perspective of a state, I talk about the perspective of not a particular state, the United States or other nations, but of a general state. And so in some cases, what I think that constitutes terrorism can be morally motivated. For instance, in the case of the Second World War, the resistance against the Nazi occupation usually is considered as something morally motivated and reasonable. But of course, for the Nazi point of view, this was something like a terrorist act that were perpetrated by the resistance. And in other cases, another problem is that some mass shootings are perpetrated by some mentally ill people, and in these cases, the political, religious ends behind these mass shootings. It is not clear whether it is the mental condition of these people that influence them and made them commit some mass murders, mass shootings, or political ends, some propaganda they were influenced by. So, thank you, and thanks for question.
Can you put your definition back?
Yeah. Here. I didn't have to put that in red. Yeah, Brian?
So, I think I'm fully convinced that a terrorist should be defined as someone who's necessarily a non-state actor. So I see your point about, well, they could be employed by the state, like their day job, but they're not acting as a state actor when they terrorize. I'm just confused about why that should necessarily be the case. So this might be a controversial example, but it certainly seems to me like by now the Islamic State is a stable political organization. It's sort of its own, whether it's recognized or not. And many people in their official capacity acting as part of the Islamic State will terrorist attacks. So why would you have to be a non-state actor in order to?
The Islamic State, when it acts within not the jurisdiction of the Islamic State, it is certainly a non-state actor. So, for instance, the Belgium attacks, the most recent, and ISIS claimed responsibility for this action, were perpetrated by some non-state actors. They weren't high officials. They weren't Belgian soldiers. So they weren't part of the system of the state of Belgium. So it is not. They were not a state actors in this case. And in the case of Syria and Iraq, I think we are talking more about a civil war than a series of terrorist acts that are committed by the Islamic State. Yeah.
When you say non-state actor, you mean that they're not an actor within the state in which they're committing the terrorist attack, or they're not state actors from their own nation? Because you were saying, well, they're not Belgian soldiers, so they're not state actors.
So non-state actors are. So terrorists act as a non-state actor. This means that when they doing some particular actions, they're not doing this action as a state actors within the jurisdiction of the state, the nation where this action is perpetrated, this terrorist act is perpetrated. Is that clear?
Yes, that clarifies.
So if, for instance, there is a secret service acting in another state, this person certainly is a state actor within the nation where she is coming from. But when she's acting in another state, and let's say she's committing some crime that we can say that she's doing some terrorist actions, then this person is acting as a non-state actor, because this person has no legitimate. He's not legitimated in doing that. Okay. Yes. Oh, you're right.
So the CIA are terrorists because they go outside the United States jurisdiction and they make political maneuvers to destabilize governments, overthrow people, assassinate people, etc. Like that's what they do.
So, yeah, under the jurisdiction of those countries, they certainly are terrorists. Yeah. Yes.
So I just have a quick question about you're saying that cartels and terrorist organizations are separate. So
Yeah.
like the Taliban is actually one of like the main contributors of heroin. So you could say that them selling heroin pays for most of their functioning as an organization. So are they a drug cartel or are they a terrorist organization or?
They can be involved in some criminal activities in order to pursue the more important end for them, which is ideological, political, and religious. So I would say that it is in this case or in other cases, it is a terrorist organization involved in some criminal activities in order to be funded simply. Yeah.
Okay.
But
and I-
at the at everybody, they are terrorists.
Okay. And I have a follow-up then.
Yeah.
So the Median drug cartel, which supplied the United States with most of its cocaine in the 80s, led by Pablo Escobar, who actually ran for government in Colombia. There's evidence that he had a presidential candidate assassinated. So he definitely had like political motivations behind his drug cartel. So would you consider that, like the Median drug cartel?
So in this case, of course, there's a problem because there's a certain vagueness in this political and religious and ideological end. But I think that if the final end of a certain organization is again ideological, then also if they use some political maneuvers and they really influence, they're really important within a certain political entourage, and they're still criminal organization. If the cartel changes its mind and its main aim becomes to just govern Mexico in an important sense, or I don't know. Impose the Catholic religion to Mexico and the United States. In this case, it would be a terrorist organization. Was Danielle and Neil? Okay, sorry.
No, please, go ahead.
Sure. So if the King of Saudi Arabia gives me $10 million to blow up grain elevators in Buffalo, has he not deputized me in some way to be a state actor?
In this case, I would talk about terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism. And so in this case, I would say that the King of Saudi Arabia...
Is state-sponsored terrorism not a kind of terrorism, though?
Yeah. No, so state-sponsored terrorism is a kind of terrorism, but what the King of Saudi Arabia is doing is not, strictly speaking, a terrorist action. I mean, he does what the person performing the terrorist act is a terrorist within the U.S. jurisdiction, but the King of Saudi Arabia is not a terrorist.
The question I was trying to get at is,
Yeah.
am I a state actor when I go and blow up the grain elevators in Buffalo?
You're a state actor for your country, but not for the United States.
So I would like to say something here. I think that Kofi Annan's complaint that he didn't have a good definition was in part precisely a complaint about the fact that in one jurisdiction, X counts as a terrorist act, and in another jurisdiction, the same X does not count as a terrorist act. And I think you haven't solved that problem.
So I didn't talk about that. I wanted to say something just quick about that. And I talked about the perspective of the state, but there can be an international perspective where people agree what terrorist is on a global level. So in this sense, also the King of Saudi Arabia would be a terrorist.